The Sumerian tablets don't just tell a creation story. They describe a deliberate edit to human memory, written into us at the moment we were made. The beings described in those tablets didn't want slaves who could plan, remember, or connect the dots across generations. And here's the part that keeps pulling me back. The oldest written records on Earth don't say we forgot. They say we were made to. Now, the tablets don't just make that claim in passing. They describe the mechanism. And once you see what the Sumerian scribes actually recorded about how this edit worked, the creation story you learned in school starts to look like a very clean summary of something far more specific. The texts describe the beings they called the Anunnaki, engineering a worker, a creature capable enough to follow instructions, but not capable enough to ask why. What's striking is the precision of that intention. It wasn't make them less intelligent, it was make them unable to hold the thread, able to learn a task, unable to remember who taught them, why it mattered, or what came before. The tablets describe this not as an accident of primitive biology, but as a feature, a deliberate constraint baked into the design of the human mind at the moment of its creation. Think about what that would actually look like from the inside. You'd be functional, you'd be teachable, you'd be capable of building extraordinary things in a single lifetime, but the knowledge wouldn't carry. Each generation would have to rediscover the same truths, make the same errors, reach the same approximate ceiling, and then stop. Not because they weren't smart enough to go further, but because the architecture wouldn't let the accumulated weight of memory pass cleanly forward. The Sumerians had a word for this, Nam Lu Ulu, roughly translated as the condition of being human, and the tablets frame it as something that was handed down, not something that simply evolved. Here's where it gets harder to dismiss. Across cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamia, oral traditions from sub-Saharan Africa, from the Andean highlands, from early Vedic texts, there are independent accounts of a primordial age when humans remembered everything, followed by a deliberate severance. Not a flood, not a plague, a severance of memory, described with the same clinical specificity the Sumerian tablets use. These traditions didn't borrow from each other. They arrived at the same descriptions separately. Which raises the question, the tablets themselves seem to be circling. If this was engineered into us, is there anything in the record that suggests it was ever meant to be permanent? But if the severance was engineered into us, the question the tablets circle back to, the one the scribes seem almost reluctant to answer directly, is whether anything survived the edit. And there's a specific detail buried in the cuneiform record that most summaries leave out entirely. The Anunnaki, as described in the tablets, didn't create humans from nothing. The texts are explicit about this. They modified something that already existed. They took what was there and reduced it, constrained it, shaped it down toward a more manageable form. Which means whatever cognitive architecture existed before the modification was, at some point, intact. The tablets don't describe building a mind from raw material. They describe capping one. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Because if you're not building from scratch, but instead placing a ceiling on something that already had range, you have a different engineering problem. You're not installing a limitation into blank hardware. You're suppressing something that will, given the right conditions, push back against the ceiling. The tablets actually account for this. There are passages, frustratingly fragmented, but consistent across multiple recovered versions, that describe the Anunnaki returning to adjust the design. Not once, repeatedly. As though the initial constraint kept loosening. Think about what that implies. If the memory suppression had been total and permanent, there would have been no need to revisit it. The fact that the record describes maintenance, periodic intervention to reinforce the limitation, suggests the underlying architecture kept reasserting itself. Something in the original design resisted being permanently capped. This is where those independent traditions become harder to set aside. The accounts from the Andean highlands and the early Vedic texts don't just describe a primordial severance. Several of them describe individuals who partially escaped it, not prophets in the religious sense. Figures described specifically as people who could hold the thread across time, who remembered not just their own lives, but the accumulated knowledge of previous ones. The traditions treat these individuals not as supernatural, but as anomalies, people in whom the cap, for reasons the texts don't fully explain, didn't fully hold. The Sumerian tablets have a category for this too. And what they say about those individuals, about what happened to them when the Anunnaki noticed, is the part of the record that tends to get quietly skipped in academic translations. Does that detail land for you? The idea that the Anunnaki had to keep coming back to reinforce the limitation, as if something in us kept pushing against it. Drop your answer in the comments below. Because what the tablets say happened to the people in whom that cap didn't hold is exactly where this gets uncomfortable. Andrew George is Professor Emeritus of Babylonian at SOAS, University of London. His critical edition of the Gilgamesh epic, published by Oxford University Press, is the standard scholarly reference for that text. He spent 16 years touring museum collections across the world, gathering source material from original cuneiform tablets before producing it. That's not a hobbyist. That's the field's most rigorous voice on this literature. And his position, the mainstream position, is clear. These are literary and religious texts reflecting ancient cosmology, not history, not a record of literal events, mythology in the technical sense. I'm not dismissing that. I think it's probably right. But here's where the mainstream position stops, and stopping there is the part I can't get past. The question of whether the Anunnaki were literal beings is almost beside the point. What the mainstream reading doesn't fully account for is the specificity of the problem these texts keep returning to. Across centuries of independent composition, the authors of the Sumerian and Babylonian record kept circling the same governance logic. Beings in authority deciding that the human population must not accumulate, must not persist long enough to compare notes, must not hold the thread across enough generations to understand the system they're inside. That's not a cosmological flourish. That's a very precise administrative concern, and the texts describe it with the same precision you'd use to describe a policy. The British Museum currently holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets in its collection, the majority of which have never been fully translated. Tens of thousands remain essentially unread since antiquity. The ones we have translated already contain this pattern: the memory constraint, the deliberate cognitive sealing, the periodic reinforcement. That pattern shows up in what we've been able to read, and I want you to sit with a specific question. What is the responsible thing to wonder about the tablets we haven't opened yet? Because the pattern in the translated record isn't scattered, it's consistent. And consistency across independently authored texts, written across centuries, is not what mythology usually does. Mythology drifts. This didn't. The next section is where this stops being about ancient theology and starts being about the structure of the world you're living in right now. The tablets describe a specific governance logic: keep the labor population cognitively bounded, reset their accumulated knowledge generationally, ensure they never live long enough to compare notes across enough time to understand the system they're inside. That is the architecture the Sumerian scribes recorded, not as a complaint, not as a myth about chaos and order, but as a design specification, a deliberate structural choice made by beings who understood exactly what they were preventing. Now hold that logic for a moment. Not the beings, the logic. Because in 2025 and 2026, the institutions managing global information architecture operate on a structurally similar principle, and the mechanism isn't deletion. That's the part worth sitting with. The UNESCO PERSIST framework, which governs which digital heritage materials are selected for long-term preservation and which are deprioritized, operates explicitly on the premise that the volume of digital information is, in their own language, almost incalculable, and that decisions must be made about what gets kept. Someone decides. The criteria are technical. The effect is a filter on what the next generation inherits. The major AI content moderation frameworks running in 2026 work the same way. Not by erasing, by noise. A category of knowledge doesn't need to be suppressed if it can simply be made practically inaccessible, buried beneath faster, louder, shorter content that resets the attention cycle before the slower, deeper material can accumulate any weight. The average content consumption loop now resets faster than a human being can build a coherent model of anything complex. You don't need to shorten a person's lifespan if you can shorten the effective window in which sustained attention is possible. The tablets called this a design choice, a deliberate cognitive sealing, maintained not through violence, but through the architecture of the environment itself. Think about what it means when the oldest written governance document on Earth and the newest information management frameworks arrive at the same functional outcome, not because anyone planned the parallel, but because the logic is simply efficient. You don't need to suppress memory if you can make the environment hostile to it. What do we call it now? Go back to the beginning of the Atrahasis epic. Not the flood narrative, not the labor strike of the lesser gods. The opening passage, the moment before humans exist. There is a line in that text, in the Akkadian, where Enlil describes what the new creature must not carry forward. Most translations render it as divine knowledge or the secrets of the gods. But the Akkadian term used, temu, doesn't mean knowledge in the abstract. It means something closer to the memory of one's origins, the capacity to know where you came from, and by extension, to understand the system you're inside. That word matters, because the thing Enlil was protecting against wasn't rebellion through weapons or numbers. It was rebellion through comprehension. Now that you have the full context of what the preceding sections built, the deliberate cognitive ceiling, the periodic maintenance of the constraint, the parallel governance logic running in 2026's information environment, read that line again. The oldest written governance document on Earth is not describing a god jealous of his power. It's describing an administrator removing a specific cognitive tool from a population he intends to manage indefinitely. The tool was temporal memory. The mechanism was a lifespan too short to accumulate it, and an environment too noisy to sustain it. Close the pattern stack, because it closes cleanly. The Atrahasis describes the ceiling. The Gilgamesh epic describes what happens to the one figure who tries to breach it, Gilgamesh himself, who seeks immortality not for vanity, but specifically because he understands that the knowledge he's accumulated will die with him. Genesis describes the same ceiling using different language, the tree of knowledge, the expulsion, the suddenly shortened lifespans after the fall. The Vedic accounts describe the severance. These texts don't borrow from each other. They converge on the same administrative logic independently. I want to be precise about what I'm claiming and what I'm not. I'm not telling you the Anunnaki were literal beings who walked the Mesopotamian plain. I'm telling you the governance logic they're described as using: short lives, reset knowledge, an environment hostile to accumulated memory, is the most efficient population management architecture ever committed to writing. Whether it was mythology or memory, someone thought of it first. And here is the thread I cannot close. Among the tablets in the Atrahasis series, there is a fragment, cataloged separately from the main narrative, dated by scholars to an earlier compositional layer, whose content has not been fully published in any critical edition I have been able to locate. Scholars acknowledge its existence. Its relationship to the main text is noted in the literature. What it says has not been made available in full translation. I don't know what's in it, neither do you. And after everything the translated record already contains, I find that genuinely difficult to stop thinking about. Subscribe and comment on what you would like to read about.